The sun was setting over Oak Ridge, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Officer Thomas Wilson sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. He'd been with the Oak Ridge Police Department for 12 years now. Some called him dedicated. Others had different words for his approach to policing. The radio crackled to life. All units in the vicinity of Cedar Heights. We've received reports of suspicious activity near the governor's residence. Possible trespasser. Thomas straightened in his seat. Cedar Heights was the most exclusive neighborhood in Oak Ridge home. To the wealthy, the powerful, and yes, the governor's mansion. He pressed the button on his radio. Unit 45 responding, I'm 2 minutes out. He flipped on his lights but kept the siren off as he made his way toward Cedar Heights. Thomas had always taken pride in being the first to respond, in keeping Oak Ridge safe. It was his town after all. Had been since he was born. Some things had changed over the years. Too many, in his opinion. But his job remained the same. Protect and serve. The gates of Cedar Heights appeared ahead, and Thomas slowed his vehicle. The security guard recognized him and waved him, through without question. Inside Cedar Heights was like entering another world. Perfectly manicured lawns surrounded massive homes set back from the street. Money and privilege were written into every brick and blade of grass. Thomas cruised slowly down Magnolia Avenue, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The residents of Cedar Heights expected a certain level of service from the police department. They paid enough in taxes to demand it. And Thomas was happy to provide it, especially when it meant keeping certain elements out of the neighborhood. As he rounded the corner onto Governor's Way, Thomas spotted a figure walking along the sidewalk. A black man in a dark hoodie, moving, slowly, seemingly studying the properties as he passed. Thomas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct that had served him well over the years. In Cedar Heights at this hour, this person didn't fit the profile of someone who belonged. Thomas pulled his patrol car to the curb about 20 yards ahead of the man and stepped out, one hand resting casually on his holster. The man hadn't noticed him yet, still focused on what appeared to be the security features of the governor's property. That's enough, Thomas muttered to himself. He unsnapped his holster and drew his weapon, holding it at the ready position. Police. Freeze. Right there, he shouted, his voice echoing down the quiet street. Hands where I can see them. The man stopped abruptly, his body tensing. Slowly he began to turn. I said, hands up. Now, Thomas barked, raising his weapon to aim directly at the man. The man raised his hands, but there was something in his posture that bothered Thomas. He wasn't cowering or showing the fear that Thomas expected. Instead, he stood straight, his movements deliberate and calm. Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding, the man said, his voice steady. Shut up and keep those hands where I can see them, Thomas snapped, advancing slowly. What are you doing in this neighborhood? I live here, the man replied. Simply. Thomas nearly laughed. Sure you do, and I'm the Tooth Fairy. What's your name? My name is Anthony Richards, the man said calmly. And I do live here. Right there, in fact. He tilted his head slightly toward the governor's mansion. Thomas tightened his grip on his weapon. This guy was either crazy or playing some kind of game, and Thomas didn't like either option. You expect me to believe you live in the governor's mansion? Turn around and get on your knees, now. Anthony didn't move. Officer, I'm going to reach for my ID very slowly. It will explain everything. Don't you dare move those hands, Thomas shouted, taking another step forward. His heart was pounding now. Something wasn't right here. But all his instincts told him this man didn't belong, couldn't possibly be telling the truth. I understand you're doing your job, Anthony continued in that same measured tone. But pointing a weapon at me is unnecessary. I am simply walking on my own property. Thomas felt a bead of sweat roll down his back despite the cool evening air. The confidence in this man's voice was unsettling. Most people, the guilty ones especially, showed fear when staring down the barrel of a police officer's gun. This man showed none. Last warning. On your knees, hands behind your head, or I will consider you a threat. The sound of a door opening nearby caught Thomas's attention, though he kept his eyes and weapon trained on Anthony. "Sir, is everything all right?" a voice called out. From the corner of his eye, Thomas saw a man in a suit stepping out from the guardhouse near the governor's mansion. The security detail. "Frank, could you please inform this officer who I am?" Anthony called out, his hands still raised. The security guard, Frank, hurried over, then stopped abruptly when he saw the scene. "Officer Wilson, what are you doing? This man claims he lives at the governor's residence," Thomas cut in, not lowering his weapon. "You know him?" Frank's face registered shock. "Officer Wilson, that's Governor Richards. Sir, I'm so sorry about this." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. "Governor?" He felt the blood drain from his face as he really looked, at the man he had his weapon pointed at, Anthony Richards, the governor of the state, the first black governor in the state's history. Thomas slowly lowered his weapon, his mind reeling. How had he not recognized him? The governor had been all over the news since his election 2 years ago. "Governor Richards, Thomas began, but the words died in his throat. "Please secure your weapon, officer," the governor said, finally lowering his hands. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held Thomas's gaze steadily. Thomas holstered his gun with shaking hands. The enormity of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. He had drawn his weapon on the governor, mistaking him for a trespasser in front of his own home. Frank from security had moved to the governor's side now, speaking quietly into a radio on his wrist. Within moments, 2 more security personnel appeared from the direction of the mansion. "Everything's under control," Governor Richards told them, raising a hand to calm the situation. "Officer Wilson and I were just having a misunderstanding." Thomas felt sick. "Sir, I didn't recognize you. We had reports of suspicious activity in the area, and when I saw you looking at the security features, I was checking the perimeter of my home," Governor Richards explained evenly. "We've had some concerns about security gaps, so I was walking the property myself." The security team looked as uncomfortable as Thomas felt. One of them, a woman with short gray hair, stepped forward. "Sir, we should move inside." Governor Richards nodded but then turned back to Thomas. "Officer Wilson, would you join me inside for a moment?" Thomas blinked in surprise. Join him? Inside? After what had just happened, he expected to be reported, suspended, possibly fired, not invited in for what? Tea? Yes, sir. Of course, Thomas managed to say. As they walked toward the mansion, Thomas felt as though he were moving through a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare of his own making. The manicured path leading to the governor's residence seemed a mile long. Every step was heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Behind him, he could hear Frank and the security team following at a discreet distance, no doubt wondering. The same thing Thomas was. What was Governor Richards planning to do about the officer who had just held him at gunpoint outside his own home? The grand door of the mansion loomed ahead, and Thomas had never felt smaller in his entire life. The governor stepped forward, his keycard granting them access to the imposing residence. "This way, Officer Wilson," Governor Richards said, his voice giving away nothing of what he might be feeling. Thomas nodded, swallowing hard as he followed the governor inside, leaving the darkening evening behind them. The door closed with a heavy finality, and Thomas knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened next would change everything. Thomas stepped into the governor's mansion, his police boots suddenly feeling too heavy and too loud on the marble floor. The entrance hall was grand but tasteful, with photographs of the state's landmarks lining the walls instead of the flashy artwork he'd expected. Governor Richards walked ahead with the confidence of a man in his own home, which, of course, he was. "This way, Officer Wilson," the governor said, leading him past what appeared to be a formal dining room and into a smaller, more comfortable study. Books lined the walls, and a desk with papers neatly stacked sat in one corner. 2 leather chairs faced each other near a window overlooking the back gardens. "Have a seat," Governor Richards said, gesturing to one of the chairs while he took the other. The security team had followed them but remained outside the door, their presence felt but not seen. Thomas sat down stiffly, his hat clutched in his hands. His mouth felt dry. He should say something, apologize, explain, defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. What could he possibly say that would make this situation any better? "Would you like some water?" the governor asked, noticing Thomas's discomfort. "No, sir, thank you, sir," Thomas replied automatically, then winced at how stiff he sounded. Governor Richards studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. He was dressed casually in jeans and the hoodie that had seemed so suspicious to Thomas just minutes ago. Up close, Thomas could now see the state seal embroidered, small on the chest, a detail he'd completely missed before. "Do you know why I asked you to come inside, Officer Wilson?" the governor finally asked. Thomas swallowed hard. "To file a formal complaint, sir. I understand completely. What I did was, I made a serious mistake." "A mistake," Governor Richards repeated, testing the word. "Tell me, what exactly was your mistake?" The question caught Thomas off guard. He'd expected anger, accusations, threats, to his job, not this calm inquiry that somehow felt worse. Thomas struggled to find the right words. "I approached a situation with preconceived notions. I failed to properly identify myself. I escalated unnecessarily by drawing my weapon. And I didn't recognize you, sir, which is inexcusable. Those are procedural mistakes," the governor noted. "Important ones, certainly, but I'm more interested in why those mistakes happened in the first place." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Sir, I received a call about suspicious activity. And, when you saw me, what made you suspicious?" Governor Richards cut in, his voice still calm but insistent. The room fell silent. Thomas felt heat rising to his face. They both knew the answer. "You saw a black man in a hoodie in a wealthy neighborhood and you immediately assumed I didn't belong," the governor continued when Thomas didn't respond. "You didn't consider that I might live there. You didn't approach to ask questions first. You drew your weapon on an unarmed citizen who was doing nothing more threatening than walking on a public sidewalk." Each word landed like a blow, but Thomas couldn't deny any of it. "Yes, sir," he managed to say. That's what happened." "Governor," Richards leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what I was thinking when I turned around and saw your gun pointed at me, Officer Wilson?" Thomas shook his head. "I was thinking about my son," the governor said quietly. "He's 16. Smart kid, wants to be a doctor someday, and every time he leaves the house I worry. Not just the normal parent worry, I worry that he'll encounter someone who sees him the way you saw me tonight. Someone who assumes he doesn't belong. Someone with a gun and the authority to use it." Thomas felt something crack inside him. He'd never thought about it that way before. Never had to. "The difference between me and most black men in this country," Governor Richards continued, "is that when you realized who I was, that gun came down. My title protected me. My position saved me. But what about all the people without a title? What happens to them?" Outside the window, darkness had fully settled. Over the garden, Thomas could see their reflections in the glass. The governor, sitting tall and dignified, himself hunched and diminished. "I don't know what to say, sir," Thomas finally admitted. "Except that I'm sorry. Truly sorry." "I believe you are, Governor." Richards nodded. "But sorry doesn't change systems, Officer Wilson. Sorry doesn't save lives." A knock at the door interrupted them. Frank, the security guard, poked his head in. "Sir, Chief Hernandez is on the line. He's heard about the incident. News traveled fast in Oak Ridge. Of course, the police chief would already know." Governor Richards nodded. "Tell him I'll call him back shortly." He turned back to Thomas as Frank closed the door. "Your chief is probably worried about lawsuits, bad press, protests, the usual concerns when something like this happens." Thomas nodded miserably. His career was over, 12 years down the drain because of one terrible mistake. "I haven't decided what I'm going to do about this yet," the governor said, surprising Thomas. "But I want to show you something first." He reached for his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then handed it to Thomas. It was a video, security footage from a camera on the mansion's exterior. Thomas watched with growing horror as the scene from earlier played out from a different angle. He saw himself exit the patrol car, immediately draw his weapon, and advance on the governor. The body language, the aggression, it was all there in black and white. This is how the world would see it if I released this footage, Governor Richards said quietly as Thomas handed the phone back, his hand shaking slightly. How would you judge the officer in that video if it wasn't you? Harshly, Thomas admitted, his voice barely audible. I'd judge him harshly. Governor Richards nodded slowly. There's another video I want you to see, he said, swiping to a different file on his phone. This one's from last month. The new video showed the governor's teenage son walking home from what looked like a basketball game, still in his uniform. A police cruiser pulled up beside him, not Thomas's, someone else from the department. The interaction was brief, but clear. The officer made the boy put his hands on the car, patted him down, checked his ID, and eventually let him go, all within view of the governor's mansion. That's the third time that's happened to my son this year, Governor Richards said, as he took the phone back. Different officers each time. He was just walking home. Thomas felt sick. I didn't know, sir. Most people don't know, Officer Wilson. That's the problem. Governor Richards sighed. They don't know because they don't have to know. They don't live it. A heavy silence fell between them. Thomas's mind was racing, replaying incidents from his career, interactions he'd had, assumptions he'd made. How many times had he done something similar without even thinking about it? What happens now, sir? Thomas finally asked. Governor Richards stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. That depends partly on you, Officer Wilson. I could file a formal complaint. With this footage, you'd likely be fired. There would be press, protests, the whole cycle we've seen too many times before. He turned back to face Thomas. And then what? Another officer loses his job. There's outrage for a week or two, and nothing really changes. Thomas remained silent, waiting. Or, the governor continued, we could try something different. Something that might actually make a difference. Different how? Thomas asked cautiously. I've been working on a police reform initiative, Governor, Richards explained. Not just the usual sensitivity training that everyone sits through and forgets. Something more substantial. Community immersion programs, policy changes, accountability measures that have real teeth. He walked back to his chair and sat down again, leaning forward with intensity. What if you were part of that? What if instead of becoming another statistic in this endless cycle, you became part of the solution? Thomas blinked in surprise. You want me to help with police reform? After what I did tonight? Sometimes the people who need to be part of the change are the ones who understand the problem from the inside, Governor Richards said. You made a terrible mistake tonight, Officer Wilson. No question about that. But mistakes can be powerful. Teachers, if we let them be. Outside the study, voices could be heard. The situation was escalating beyond the walls of this room. Soon there would be no containing it. I don't deserve a second chance, Thomas said honestly. This isn't about what you deserve, Governor Richards replied. It's about what might actually create change. The question is, are you willing to do the hard work that change requires? Before Thomas could answer, another knock came at the door. This time, Frank looked more urgent. Sir, there's something you need to see. Someone across the street caught the incident on their phone. It's already online. Governor Richards closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. Thank you, Frank. He turned, back to Thomas. It seems our time for private conversation is running out. I need your answer, Officer Wilson. When this breaks, and it will break big, do I tell the world that you've been disciplined? Or do I tell them that we're working together to ensure this never happens to anyone else? Thomas looked into the governor's eyes and saw something he hadn't expected. Hope. Not naive hope, but the stubborn, determined kind that persists despite evidence to the contrary. The kind of hope that changes things. I'm in, Thomas said quietly. Whatever it takes. Outside, blue lights began to flash as more police cars arrived at the mansion. The night was just beginning. By morning, the video had spread like wildfire. Thomas sat in his small apartment, blinds drawn, watching his phone explode with notifications. He'd been placed on administrative leave. For your own safety, Chief Hernandez had said. though they both knew it was as much for the department's protection as his own. The video wasn't even 2 minutes long, but it told a damning story. A white police officer drawing his weapon on an unarmed black man who turned out to be the governor. The headlines wrote themselves. Thomas hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Governor Richards with his hands in the air. He saw the security footage the governor had shown him. He saw the governor's son being stopped for simply walking home. His doorbell rang, startling him. Thomas approached cautiously and peered through the peephole. Chief Hernandez stood outside, alone, his face grim. Thomas opened the door. "Chief," he said, stepping aside to let the older man in. Chief Hernandez entered, removing his hat. He was a stocky man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and deep lines around his eyes. Lines that seemed deeper today. "You look terrible," the chief said bluntly. "Feel worse," Thomas admitted, closing the door. "I've got reporters camped outside the station," Hernandez said, following Thomas into the small living room. "The mayor's been calling nonstop. The commissioner wants your badge." Thomas nodded. He'd expected as much. "I understand." "Do you?" Hernandez asked, fixing Thomas with a hard stare. "Because I'm not sure I do. 12 years on the force, Wilson. 12 years of solid work, and then you pull this?" He shook his head. "What were you thinking?" "I wasn't," Thomas said simply. "That's the problem, isn't it? I wasn't thinking. I was reacting. Saw a black man in a hoodie in Cedar Heights and made assumptions." Hernandez sighed heavily and sat down on Thomas's couch. "At least you're honest about it." He ran a hand over his face. "The governor's office called this morning. I thought for sure they were going to demand your termination." Thomas looked up sharply. And I'm not entirely sure what's happening," Hernandez admitted. "The governor wants to meet. With both of us. This afternoon." "He mentioned something last night," Thomas said, remembering their conversation in the study. "About a police reform initiative." Hernandez frowned. "He talked to you about police reform while you had a gun on him?" "After," Thomas clarified. "He invited me inside. We talked." The chief looked surprised. "You didn't mention that part." "It was private," Thomas said. "I thought he might change his mind once the video went viral." Hernandez checked his watch. "Well, we're due at the governor's office downtown in 2 hours. I suggest you shower and put on your dress uniform." He stood up. "And Wilson? I can't protect you if this goes south. You understand that, right?" Thomas nodded. "I know, Chief." After Hernandez left, Thomas stood under the shower for a long time, letting the hot water pound against his back. He thought about his father, also a cop, and the lessons he'd taught Thomas growing up. "We protect our own," his father had always said. Thomas had thought he understood what that meant, protecting his fellow officers, the thin blue line. Now he wondered if he'd been protecting the wrong things all along. 2 hours later, Thomas and Chief Hernandez sat in the waiting area outside the governor's downtown office. The building had extra security today, and Thomas had felt their cold stares as he walked in wearing his uniform. Word had clearly spread. The governor's assistant, a young man with a serious expression, opened the door. "The governor will see you now." They were shown into a large office with windows overlooking the state capitol building. Governor Richards stood as they entered, dressed today in a crisp suit that somehow made him look even more imposing than he had in casual clothes the night before. Chief Hernandez, Officer Wilson, he greeted them, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. "Thank you for coming." They sat down, and Thomas noticed other people in the room he hadn't registered. At first, a woman he recognized as the governor's chief of staff and a man he didn't know sitting quietly in the corner with a legal pad. "I'll get right to the point," Governor Richards said, leaning forward on his desk. "Last night's incident has created a situation that none of us can ignore. The video has over 2 million views already. My phone hasn't stopped ringing since dawn. Civil rights leaders, community organizers, other politicians." He looked directly at Thomas. "Many of them are calling for your immediate termination, Officer Wilson." Thomas nodded. He'd expected nothing less. I've spent the morning in conversations with my team, the governor continued, gesturing to the others in the room, about how to respond, about what justice looks like in this situation. Chief Hernandez shifted in his seat. Governor, if I may, Governor Richards held up a hand. Before you speak, Chief, I want to be clear about something. What happened last night was not an isolated incident. It wasn't one officer making one bad decision. It was a symptom of a systemic problem. The room fell silent. Thomas could feel the chief tensing beside him. That said, the governor continued, I believe that addressing systemic problems requires systemic solutions. Not just punishment, but change. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city before turning back to face them. Last night, Officer Wilson and I began a conversation. A difficult, honest conversation about what happened and why. I'd like to continue that conversation, but on a larger scale. The governor nodded to his chief of staff, who distributed folders to everyone in the room. This is the police reform initiative I mentioned, Governor Richards explained as Thomas opened the folder. Community oversight boards with real power, changes to training protocols, new standards for use of force, accountability, measures, and a requirement that officers spend time immersed in the communities they police, not just driving through them, but really being present, listening, learning. Thomas flipped through the pages, skimming the contents. It was comprehensive, far beyond the token reforms he'd seen proposed before. The usual approach, Governor Richards continued, would be for me to hold a press conference denouncing Officer Wilson's actions, demanding his termination, and then announcing these reforms. As a response, the department would sacrifice Wilson to appease public anger, promise to do better, and then we'd all wait for the next incident. He walked back to his desk and sat down. I'm proposing something different, something harder, but potentially more meaningful. Thomas looked up from the folder. What exactly are you suggesting, sir? I want to use what happened between us as a starting point, not an ending, Governor Richards said. Instead of a press conference where I condemn you, I want to hold a town hall. You and me, Officer Wilson, in public, having the same kind of honest conversation we started last night, followed by a series of such conversations in communities across the state. Chief Hernandez looked stunned. You want Wilson to participate in public forums? With all due respect, Governor, have you seen the comments on that video? There are threats being made. I'm well aware of the risks, Governor Richards replied calmly. But change doesn't happen in comfortable spaces, Chief. It happens when we're willing to step into discomfort and stay there long enough to learn something. He turned to Thomas. You said last night you were willing to do whatever it takes. Did you mean it? All eyes in the room turned to Thomas. He thought about the easy path. Resignation, finding another line of work, avoiding the hard conversations. Then he thought about the governor's son stopped by police outside his own home. I meant it, Thomas said firmly. But why me? Why not someone with a cleaner record, someone who hasn't messed up so publicly? Because you're real, Governor Richards said simply. You're not a villain, Officer Wilson. You're a human being who made choices based on biases you may not have even realized you had. And there are thousands of officers just like you out there. If you can change, maybe they can too. The governor's chief of staff cleared her throat. We should discuss logistics. The first town hall would be this weekend. We'd need to prepare Officer Wilson, establish ground rules, ensure security. As she spoke, Thomas felt a strange sensation building in his chest. Not the shame and fear that had consumed him since last night, but something different. Something that felt almost like purpose. There's one more thing, Governor Richards added. This only works if it's genuine. No scripts, no rehearsals. Just honest conversation, however uncomfortable it gets. The department has protocols for public statements, Chief Hernandez began. This goes beyond protocols, the governor cut in. This is about something more important. He looked at Thomas. What do you say, Officer Wilson? Are you willing to be uncomfortable in public? To admit mistakes and commit to growth in front of people who may not be ready to forgive you? Thomas took a deep breath. The path ahead looked difficult, possibly even dangerous, But for the first time since last night, he could see a way forward that wasn't just about saving his job or avoiding consequences. It was about something bigger. "Yes, sir," he said. "I am." Governor Richards nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "Then let's get to work. We have a lot to do before Saturday." As they left the meeting, Thomas felt the weight of what lay ahead. The cameras, the angry questions, the skepticism from all sides. But he also felt something he hadn't expected, a sense that maybe, just maybe, his worst mistake could somehow become the beginning of something important. The community center was packed to capacity. People stood along the walls, crammed into every available space. The air felt thick with tension, and with the late summer heat that the building's old air conditioning system couldn't quite handle. Thomas sat on the stage, tugging uncomfortably at his collar. He'd chosen to wear civilian clothes tonight, a simple button-down shirt and slacks, rather than his uniform. The governor's team had suggested it might be less provocative, less like he was hiding behind a badge. From his seat, Thomas could see familiar faces in the crowd. Some of his fellow officers had come, sitting stiffly in the back rows. Chief Hernandez was there too, his expression unreadable. But most of the faces belonged to community members, many angry, some curious, all watching him with intensity. Governor Richards approached the podium and the murmuring crowd fell silent. "Thank you all for coming tonight," the governor began. "I know many of you are here because you saw the video. You saw an officer of the law draw his weapon on an unarmed man, on me, for nothing more than walking in my own neighborhood." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Someone called out, "Why's he still got a job?" The governor nodded, acknowledging the question without answering it directly. "I understand the anger. I've felt it myself many times. But tonight, I'm asking for something difficult. I'm asking for us to move beyond anger toward understanding. Not to excuse what happened, but to examine it, to learn from it, to use it as a catalyst for real change." He gestured to Thomas. "Officer Wilson agreed to be here tonight, to face you directly, to answer your questions honestly. That takes courage. The easy path would have been resignation, disappearance from public view. Instead, he's chosen the harder path. I hope we can all bring the same courage to this conversation." With that, the governor invited Thomas to the podium. As Thomas rose from his chair, his legs felt unsteady. The walk to the microphone seemed to take forever. "My name is Thomas Wilson," he began, his voice shakier than he'd hoped. 6 days ago, I made a terrible mistake. I saw a black man in a hoodie in a wealthy neighborhood, and I immediately assumed he didn't belong there. I drew my weapon without cause. I escalated a situation that didn't need escalating." He paused, looking out over the audience. Some faces had softened slightly, but others remained hard, skeptical. "I could give you excuses," Thomas continued. "Tell you about the call that came in about suspicious activity. Talk about officer safety protocols. But the truth is simpler and harder to admit. I saw the governor's skin color before I saw anything else about him. And I made judgments based on that. Dangerous judgments." A woman in the front row stood up. "My 17-year-old son got stopped by police 3 times last month walking home from basketball practice. 3 times in 1 month. How is he supposed to feel safe?" Thomas nodded, remembering the video of the governor's son. He shouldn't have to go through that. No one should. "But they do," another voice called out. "Every day?" "Yes," Thomas admitted. "They do." For the next hour, Thomas stood at that podium, facing question after difficult question. Why did he draw his weapon so quickly? Had he done similar things before? Did he really believe this conversation would change anything? Some questions felt like attacks, others like genuine attempts to understand. Through it all, Thomas tried to answer honestly, even when the truth made him look bad, even when it hurt to say out loud. Halfway through, a middle-aged man stood up. "I was a police officer for 23 years, he said. "Retired now. And I want to ask you something, Officer Wilson. Before that night, had you ever really examined your own biases? Really looked at them?" Thomas hesitated. "No," he finally said. "I thought I was one of the good ones. I thought that was enough. The retired officer nodded, a look of recognition crossing his face. It took me 15 years to even begin that work. Most never start. As the town hall continued, something shifted in the room. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed form. Instead of an angry mob facing a guilty officer, they became something more complex. A community wrestling with difficult truths together. Governor Richards joined Thomas for the final portion, sharing his own experiences of being profiled. Even as an elected official, he spoke about his son, about the conversations black parents have with their children that white parents never need to have. The system isn't broken, the governor said at one point. It's working exactly as it was, designed to. That's the problem. We need a new design. As the event wound down, a young woman approached the microphone for what would be the final question of the night. She couldn't have been more than 20, and her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "I've heard a lot of words tonight," she said. "But I've heard words before. What's actually going to change?" Governor Richards stepped forward. "That's the question that matters most," he acknowledged. "Words without action are meaningless." He outlined the police reform initiative, explaining the concrete steps already in motion, the oversight board being formed, the training protocols being rewritten, the community immersion program being developed. Officer Wilson will be one of the first participants in that program, the governor added, not as punishment but as part of a commitment to growth and change. Thomas nodded, then added, "I also want to be clear about something. I'm not asking for forgiveness tonight. I haven't earned that yet. What I'm asking for is the chance to do better, to be better, to help create a department that serves everyone equally." As the town hall ended, Thomas expected to feel relief. Instead, he felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and energy. The hard conversations were just beginning. Outside the community center, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. Governor Richards handled most of the questions but occasionally directed one to Thomas. They were standing side by side, no longer as adversaries, but as unlikely partners in what was quickly becoming a statewide conversation about policing. Later that night, Thomas sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through news coverage of the town hall. Some headlines were skeptical. PR stunt or real reform? Others were more hopeful. Confrontation leads to conversation. Officer and governor join forces. His phone buzzed with a text from the governor. "You did well tonight, rest up. Tomorrow we do it again in Riverside." Thomas set down his phone and walked to the window. The city lights blinked in the distance. Somewhere out there, officers were on patrol, making split-second decisions, carrying their own biases into every encounter. One conversation wouldn't change that. One officer facing consequences wouldn't change that. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Chief Hernandez. "Some of the officers want to talk. About tonight. About the reforms. I think they're ready to listen." Thomas texted back, "Set it up, I'll be there, B." He thought about the retired officer at the town hall, how it had taken him 15 years to begin examining his biases. Thomas had been forced to confront his in the most public way possible. A harsh awakening, but maybe a necessary one. As he got ready for bed, Thomas caught sight of his uniform hanging in the closet. The badge that had once seemed like a shield now felt like a responsibility in a way it never had before. He wasn't sure if he'd ever look at it the same way again. His phone buzzed one more time. A news alert. Video of Police Governor Town Hall. Goes viral. This is what accountability looks like. The headline struck him. Accountability. Not punishment, not cancellation, not defending the indefensible, but true accountability. Facing those he had wronged. Listening to hard truths. Committing to change. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to erase what he'd done. But it was something. A beginning. Thomas Wilson slept better that night than he had in a week. Tomorrow would bring another town hall, more difficult questions, more painful truths. But for the first time since he'd drawn his weapon on Governor Richards, he felt something like hope. Not hope that people would forget what he'd done, but hope that his mistake might somehow lead to something better, something that might prevent another officer from making the same mistake, something that might mean another black man could walk down the street in his own neighborhood without fear. It wasn't redemption, but it was purpose, and for now, that was enough. 1 year later, the classroom fell silent as Thomas entered. 25 police cadets sat at attention, their faces a mix of curiosity and wariness. They knew who he was. Everyone in the department did. The officer who had pulled a gun on the governor. The officer who, instead of being fired, had become part of something unexpected. "Good morning," Thomas said, setting his materials down on the desk. "My name is Officer Thomas Wilson. For the next week, I'll be leading your community engagement training." He could see the skepticism in some of their eyes, the same skepticism he'd faced from fellow officers when he'd returned to duty 6 months ago, no longer on patrol, but as part of the new training division created under Governor Richard's police reform initiative. "Let's start with a simple question," Thomas continued. "Why did you decide to become police officers?" The answers came hesitantly at first, then with more confidence: to help people, to make a difference, to follow in a parent's footsteps, to protect and serve. Thomas nodded. "Those were my reasons too 12 years ago when I joined the force, and I believed I was living up to those ideals." He paused. "Until the night I wasn't." The room grew quieter. Everyone knew the story, but few had heard it directly from him. "Today isn't about that night," Thomas said. "Not exactly. It's about what I've learned since then, about how easy it is to think you're one of the good ones while still causing harm, about the difference between intention and impact." For the next 3 hours, Thomas led the cadets through exercises designed to make them uncomfortable, in the necessary way that growth requires. They discussed implicit bias not as an abstract concept, but as a real force that shapes split-second decisions. They reviewed body camera footage from incidents across the country and broke down exactly where things went wrong. And Thomas shared his own story, not to ask for sympathy, but to show how quickly assumptions can escalate into dangerous situations. "The badge doesn't make you infallible," he told them. "It makes you responsible." As the class ended for the day, one of the cadets approached him, a young woman with determination in her eyes. "Can I ask you something, sir?" she said. "Something personal?" Thomas nodded. "Do you regret staying on the force after everything that happened?" It would have been easier to just leave. Thomas considered the question carefully. "Easier, yes," he admitted. "But not better. Not for me and not for the community we serve." He gathered his papers. "Come back tomorrow. I think you'll understand more after the next session." The next morning, the cadets arrived to find not just Thomas, but Governor Richards himself waiting for them. A year had passed since the incident, but the governor's presence still commanded attention. He stood at the front of the room in a casual suit, no aides or security detail visible. "I'm not here as governor today," he told the surprised cadets. "I'm here as a citizen, a father, and someone who has experienced both the protection and the prejudice of law enforcement." For the next hour, Governor Richards shared stories, not just of the night Thomas had drawn a weapon on him, but of a lifetime of interactions with police, the good and the bad, the officer who had helped, his mother when their car broke down on a rural road, the officer who had followed his teenage self around a store for no reason other than suspicion based on skin color. "The uniform you'll wear carries the weight of all these stories," the governor told them. "Every interaction your predecessors have had with the community, positive or negative, shapes how people will see you before you say a single word." Thomas watched the cadets' faces as they listened. Some looked uncomfortable, others thoughtful. All seemed to be truly hearing what the governor was saying. After Governor Richards left, Thomas split the cadets into groups for their afternoon assignment, community listening sessions in neighborhoods across the city. Each group would spend time not patrolling, not questioning, just listening to residents about their experiences with police. "Don't defend, don't explain," Thomas instructed them. Just listen. Really listen. That evening, Thomas drove to the governor's mansion for the quarterly review meeting of the Police Reform Initiative. As he pulled up to the security gate, he couldn't help but remember that night a year ago, how differently things might have turned out. Frank, the security guard who had witnessed the original confrontation, gave him a nod as he passed through. Evening, Officer Wilson. The review committee met in the same study where Thomas and Governor Richards had their first real conversation. But now the room held a dozen people, community leaders, police representatives, policy experts, all gathered around a large table covered with reports and data. Officer Wilson, Governor Richards greeted him warmly. Just in time. We were about to review the community response survey. The meeting lasted 3 hours. They discussed what was working and what wasn't. The Oversight Board had processed 37 complaints in the past quarter, resulting in 5 officers being removed from duty and many more receiving additional training. The Community Immersion Program had expanded to 3 neighboring cities. Use of force incidents were down 30%. Progress, but not perfection. Some officers still resisted the changes. Some community members still didn't trust the reforms would last. The work was ongoing. As the meeting wound down, Governor Richards asked Thomas to stay behind. When the room had cleared, the governor poured 2 glasses of water and sat down across from him. My son got his college acceptance letter yesterday, Governor Richards said. Pre-med, just like he wanted. Thomas smiled. That's great news, sir. He told me something interesting, the governor continued. He said he feels different walking around town these days. Not completely at ease. We're not there yet, but different. The reforms are working, Thomas said. Some of them, Governor Richards agreed. But he specifically mentioned your cadet training program, said his friend's brother is in the current class and comes home talking about it every night. Thomas felt a surge of unexpected pride. They're good kids, they want to do right. We all do most of the time, the governor said. He set down his glass. The state police commissioner is retiring next month. Thomas nodded, unsure where this was going. I'm creating a new position, Governor Richards continued. Director of Community-Oriented Policing Standards, statewide oversight of training and accountability measures. Implementing what we've built here across all departments. Thomas stared at him. Sir, are you offering me? I'm asking if you'd consider it, the governor cut in. It won't be easy. You'll face resistance from old-school departments. You'll be seen as either a traitor or a token, depending on who's looking. But you've earned credibility on both sides in a way few people have. Thomas fell silent, turning the idea over in his mind. From nearly losing his badge to helping reshape policing across the state. It seemed impossible, yet here it was, a real opportunity. I'll need to think about it, he finally said. Of course, the governor replied. Take some time. As Thomas drove home that night, he took the long route, passing through neighborhoods he'd once patrolled. So much had changed in a year, yet so much remained the same. The real work was just beginning. His phone rang. It was Lisa, one of the community organizers who had initially called for his firing and had since become an unlikely ally in the reform efforts. Just checking you're still on for the youth forum tomorrow, she said when he answered. These kids have tough questions. Wouldn't miss it, Thomas assured her. Tough questions are the only ones worth answering these days. After hanging up, Thomas pulled over and parked, looking out at the city lights. He thought about the cadets he was training, the commissioner position Governor Richards had offered, the long road ahead. He thought about how a single moment, a terrible mistake, had somehow led here, not to redemption. He still didn't use that word. The man who had stared down the barrel of his gun that night deserved better than a self-congratulatory story about personal redemption. No, this wasn't about redemption. It was about responsibility, about taking a wrong and using it to help create something right. As he pulled back onto the road, Thomas noticed a patrol car in his rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he felt the old tension, the instinctive wariness that so many felt when those lights appeared. Then he recognized the car's number. one of his former rookies now patrolling on his own. Thomas watched as the patrol car passed a group of teenagers walking home, slowing slightly but continuing on without stopping them. A small thing, perhaps. A decision not to intervene without cause. But in that small decision lay the seeds of something important. Change happened slowly in moments like these, in decisions to listen rather than assume, to engage rather than escalate, to recognize humanity in each face regardless of color. There would be setbacks. There would be officers who resisted, communities that remained skeptical, systems that pushed back against transformation. The work would never truly be finished. But as Thomas drove toward home, he felt something that had been missing for much of his career. Not pride in a badge or a title, but purpose in a calling. A true understanding of what it meant to protect and serve, not just some of the people, but all of them. 1 year ago, he had made the worst mistake of his life. Now he had the chance to help make sure others didn't make the same one. It wasn't enough, it would never be enough, but it was a beginning.